What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? That thought hit Frank Delaney harder than the Indiana wind slicing through the crack in his garage door. He stood there, 73 years old, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted a faded ball cap that hadn't fit right since the Clinton administration. Dust floated in shafts of light from the single window like ghosts of the past swirling through the air. The garage smelled like rust, oil, and time, everything that used to mean something. In the corner, next to an old workbench stacked with half-used bolts and yellowing receipts from the 80s, sat a cracked plastic tub labeled Generator 1.0. The label was barely visible, but Frank didn't need it. He knew exactly what was in there. He hadn't opened that box in over 3 decades. Not since he gave up on the dream. His fingers hovered over the lid. The wind rattled the garage door again. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's car started, and a kid yelled something about a TikTok challenge. He didn't know what that meant. No one asked Frank about those things. Hell, no one asked Frank about anything anymore. He used to matter. He used to build things. Fix things. Solve problems. When Shirley was alive, she used to say, "Frank, you're the kind of man who turns broken into beautiful." Now everything felt broken, including himself. His knees cracked when he walked. His back ached before it rained. Even his daughter, Mallory, barely called anymore. "Just checking in, Dad," she'd say, voice distracted, like her phone was already halfway back in her purse. Then she'd be gone again for another week. Maybe more. He wasn't angry. Just, used to it. The world had moved on without him. He was just some old guy now, floating through grocery aisles, nodding at people who didn't see him. But that box. Inside that box was a version of Frank who still believed he could do something that mattered. A man who once sketched out a solar-powered generator he swore could change the way small towns handled blackouts. He remembered showing it to a professor once, who said, "This is ambitious for a guy without a degree." Frank laughed it off at the time, but he never forgot the sting. He could see it in Shirley's eyes too, the pride, but also the worry. He had a family to feed. A mortgage. Dreams were a luxury. The generator never made it past the garage. Until now. With a grunt, Frank pulled the lid off and peered inside. The old diagrams, curled and yellowed, still bore his handwriting. Inverter 2.0, reduce heat loss. Battery efficiency. There were notes, ideas, even calculations he didn't understand anymore. His eyes burned. Maybe from dust. Maybe not. The TV inside the house was still on, he could hear the faint voice of a news anchor trailing off, replaced by a louder voice, familiar and sharp. He stepped closer. It was Elon Musk, speaking at a conference. Something about aging, about invention. Frank reached for the remote, turned up the volume. Elon's voice cut through the noise like a scalpel. "Some people are just waiting to be remembered. You can't wait. You build." Frank froze. The words hung there in the air like thunder. You can't wait. You build. He didn't know why, but it hit him square in the chest. His fingers gripped the edge of the box harder. All these years, he thought he was waiting for, what? Permission? A sign? A second chance? Maybe he was just waiting to feel like someone again. He looked back down at the faded diagrams. The paper trembled in his hand, but it was more from emotion than weakness. The generator idea wasn't perfect, maybe not even useful anymore, but it was his. A relic of belief. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel old. He felt something waking up. He took the papers and walked them to the workbench. Brushed aside a pile of screwdrivers and laid them flat. He didn't know what he'd do next. Maybe just stare at them. Maybe just hold on to the feeling for a minute longer. Then the voice in his head, Elon's voice, echoed again. Build. He looked up and saw his reflection in the small window. Weathered face, sunken cheeks, eyes tired but alert. He didn't recognize himself. Or maybe, he finally did. He reached for a pencil. It broke in half in his grip. He laughed. He hadn't laughed in a while. Not like that. The kind of laugh that cracks something open. He shuffled over to the kitchen drawer inside the house, past a pile of unread mail and cold coffee, and found an old pen. The ink still worked. He returned to the garage, scribbled a note in the margin of the blueprint. Start here. No excuses. His hands were steadier now. A bird chirped outside. He hadn't noticed birds in months. Everything had felt muted, gray. But now the air smelled like oil and beginnings. He wasn't thinking about how long he had left or how much he'd lost. He was thinking about what could still be done. What could still be built. He knew the world wouldn't care right away. Maybe not ever. But for the first time since Shirley died, and since Mallory stopped needing him, Frank felt like he had something to give. And that feeling? It was more powerful than anything he'd known in a long, long time. He didn't know if Elon Musk would ever know what his words did. Maybe they were just part of a speech. Maybe he didn't mean them the way Frank took them. But it didn't matter. The words landed where they needed to. Like a match in a dark room. And Frank wasn't sitting in the dark anymore. He was standing in the garage, blueprint under his hands, memory in his bones, and purpose whispering, again, again, again. He didn't need the world to believe in him. He just needed to believe enough to try. He stood there for another minute, hand resting on the paper, mind flickering between past and present, pain and possibility. Then he whispered to himself, not quite sure where the voice was coming from but certain it was right, why not me? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Delaney had once been someone people waited for. That's what he remembered most about the old days, people needing him. At the small-town auto shop he co-owned with his buddy Ray, folks would line up for Frank, not because he was fast, but because he cared. He'd look a customer in the eye, ask about their kids, listen to the rattle of an engine the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, then stay late if it meant getting someone's car back in time for their shift at the factory. There was purpose in his hands. Grease under the nails, scars from bolts and engines and hot exhaust pipes, but also pride. He knew machines. Knew how to bring life back into something broken. But under all that usefulness, there had always been a flicker of something else. A longing. A dream he never quite spoke out loud. Not until he was 42, sitting in the garage late one night with a beer sweating beside a half-eaten sandwich, staring at a sketch he had made on a napkin 2 weeks earlier. He had read about brownouts happening in poor neighborhoods across the country, and the thought struck him, what if there was a way to harness the sun, not in some corporate, solar panel on a mansion way, but in a real, DIY way that regular folks could use. That night, he sketched a compact generator. Solar cells charging an internal battery, a simplified inverter system, something modular that could be put together by hand, even shipped to storm-hit communities or towns with unreliable power. The design was crude, unpolished, not ready for the world. But it made his heart beat faster. He remembered showing it to Shirley the next morning over coffee. Her robe was tied loose, her hair in curlers. She studied it, smiled, then looked at him like she always did when he got that look. "Frank," she said gently, "this is beautiful. But we've got 3 mouths to feed, and you already come home smelling like burnt rubber and stress." He knew she wasn't trying to crush the idea. She was being real. Their daughter Mallory was in junior high. The shop wasn't doing as well since a chain repair center opened down the road. Their savings were tight. Dreams like this, things that took time and money, they had to be shelved. He folded up the napkin and tucked it into the back of his toolbox. But he didn't forget. Over the next few months, in the quiet moments between oil changes and brake jobs, he began working on it piece by piece. The first attempt barely ran a light bulb. The second fried a small radio. But he was learning. Slowly. Painfully. He stayed up late soldering wires and reading books from the library on energy systems. No one in town knew. Not even Ray. But Shirley did. She'd see the way his eyes lit up, the way he moved differently when he came back in from the garage. She never told him to stop, not directly. But she never encouraged it either. Maybe because she feared what would happen if he tried and failed. Or maybe because she knew what it would cost them both if he tried and succeeded. That was the thing about dreams. They could stretch you apart. He remembered one fight in particular, sharp and cold, in the dead of winter. The heater had gone out, and Mallory had a fever, and Shirley was juggling bills on the kitchen table while he was out in the garage wiring a solar array by flashlight. "Frank, it's freezing in here," she snapped when he came in. "We need heat, not some science fair project." He didn't answer. Just stood there, ashamed and angry, because she was right. He'd always known how to fix things for other people, but not always for his own family. That night, he packed everything away. Blueprints. Circuit boards. The prototype. All of it. Into that plastic tub he'd later label Generator 1.0. And from that point forward, he stopped chasing the spark. Life went on. The shop eventually closed. Ray passed away from a heart attack. Frank took a part-time job delivering parts for another garage, just to stay moving. Mallory went off to college, Shirley started having dizzy spells, then cancer. It moved fast. Too fast. One day she was laughing at a sitcom, the next she was in a hospital bed whispering, "I'm tired, Frankie. So tired." After that, the house went quiet. Like it had decided she was the only thing worth making noise for. Mallory visited often at first, then less. Then texts replaced calls. Busy with work. Dylan's got soccer. Next weekend, promise. Frank tried to be understanding. He remembered how young and hungry he was once. But loneliness isn't something that asks your permission. It just shows up and sits next to you while you eat breakfast in silence. He filled his days with routine. Walks around the block. Reruns of old westerns. Trips to the grocery store for single bananas and microwave dinners. The garage became a graveyard for old tools and older dreams. He'd walk in sometimes, stand in the doorway, then leave without touching a thing. Until the day he saw that Elon Musk clip. Until those 5 words lit a fuse inside him that had never really gone out. "You can't wait. You build." It echoed louder than anything he'd heard in years. It was more than just advice, it felt like a challenge. A dare. Like someone had finally seen past his wrinkles and age spots and reached into the part of him that still wanted to matter. He wondered why that moment hit harder than the others. He had heard motivational quotes before. Read stories about late bloomers, seniors taking art classes, old folks going viral for dance moves. But this was different. Maybe because Elon wasn't some soft-spoken guru whispering about inner peace. He was fire and steel and ambition. He was building rockets and digging tunnels and buying platforms and making people mad, and moving anyway. He wasn't asking for permission. He was daring the impossible. And that's what Frank had buried years ago, that small, sharp belief that maybe, just maybe, he could do something impossible too. Not for money. Not for fame. But because it was in him. Because that's who he was before the world told him to settle down. Before the quiet years. Before the couch became his anchor. He could still see it, the young man in the garage, sweaty and alive, tools scattered around him, sketching possibilities into existence on the back of receipts. That man wasn't gone. Just dormant. buried under years of being useful and practical and afraid. But now he was coming back. And maybe the world wouldn't notice. Maybe no one would care. But Frank did. And that had to be enough. For now. So he stood there, the echo of Elon's voice fading from the television, the old blueprint spread out before him like a map to somewhere he had forgotten he wanted to go. His knees hurt. His back was stiff. He didn't remember half the math. But he was ready to try. Not just to remember who he was, but to become something more. Something new. Not just the old mechanic. Not just the widower. Not just the man who used to matter. But someone who mattered again. Frank Delaney sat at the kitchen table, a cup of instant coffee cooling beside a pile of opened bills and prescription bottles, his mind running slower than it used to. He had barely slept the night before, not because of pain or nightmares but because something in his chest wouldn't settle down. It wasn't his heart, it was a question that had taken root and wouldn't let go. Is it too late? The garage was quiet. The blueprint from the night before still lay flat beneath the lamp he had left on, casting long shadows over old oil stains on the concrete floor. His bones ached as he stood up, as they always did now in the morning. He used to jump out of bed and head to the shop before sunrise. Now it took him 10 minutes just to feel steady. He looked at his reflection in the microwave door, slouched shoulders, soft jaw, cloudy eyes. He didn't recognize the man who used to tear down engines in a single afternoon. That man was muscle, grit, and grease. This one was pills, doctor's warnings, and forgetting why he'd walked into the room. He looked back toward the garage, something pulling him there, but something else, heavier, holding him in place. He was scared. That was the truth. Scared that if he really tried to revive the generator idea and failed, it wouldn't just be an old project that didn't work, it would confirm what he'd feared for years, that he no longer had anything to offer. That the best parts of him were already behind him. That society was right to pass him over. He opened his phone and scrolled, fingers shaky. Headlines flashed by. SpaceX launch successful. Tesla hits new milestone. AI breakthrough in brain research. The world was speeding up while he was just trying to remember where he left his reading glasses. Everything felt too fast now, too loud, too smart. He typed in a search for solar power basics, and a wave of articles poured in with language he barely understood. It was like trying to read a foreign language he used to know but had long since forgotten. The articles were filled with acronyms and words like photovoltaic optimization and thermal efficiency curves. He closed the browser. That's when his phone buzzed. Mallory. A rare call. He swiped quickly, the familiar mix of hope and dread blooming in his gut. "Hey, sweetheart," he said. "Hey, Dad. Just checking in. You okay?" Her voice was clipped, rushed. Frank leaned against the counter, swallowing the silence between them. "I'm fine. Been out in the garage," he said carefully, unsure how much to share. "Oh." A pause. "Are you trying to fix something?" "Yeah, maybe. Just working on an old project. Solar generator." Silence. "Dad, that was from, what, 30 years ago?" 31, he said, then regretted the exactness. "Well, maybe be careful, okay? You shouldn't be lifting heavy stuff. Just don't want you to overdo it." Her voice was loving but laced with that patronizing tone he hated. The tone people used when talking to children or old people. He clenched his jaw. "I'm just tinkering, Mal. Nothing dangerous." "Okay," she said, clearly distracted. "Well, Dylan's got practice, so I gotta run. Love you." "Love you too," he replied, but the line had already gone dead. He stood there staring at the phone in his hand, feeling like a child who had just asked for something he wasn't allowed to have. Did she think he was losing it? Probably. Everyone did, eventually. You hit 70 and suddenly your opinion didn't count. Your ideas were cute. Your goals were nice. He dropped the phone onto the counter with a soft clatter and looked again at the garage door. He opened it slowly, the hinges creaking, and stepped inside. The blueprint hadn't moved. Neither had the tools. But something in him had. He walked to the workbench, picked up a soldering iron, and stared at it. It felt foreign. Heavy. The last time he'd used it, he still had a full head of hair. He plugged it in anyway. Just then, a noise from outside, his neighbor, Greg, walking his dog. Greg, mid-40s, always polite but distant, waved. Frank waved back through the open garage but noticed the man's glance lingered on the bench, on the mess of wires and old components. "What are you working on, Frank?" he asked casually. Frank hesitated, unsure how to make it sound serious. "Old invention. Trying to make a solar generator." Greg raised his eyebrows. "Oh. Cool. Like, just for fun?" Frank didn't answer. Greg smiled thinly and kept walking. The tone in his voice had been polite, but underneath it, Frank heard the same thing he always heard when people asked what he was doing: confusion, disbelief, mild amusement. As if to say, "Aren't you a little old for that?" That night, Frank couldn't sleep again. The questions bounced around in his head like loose bolts in a dryer. Does anyone care? Does this even matter? Am I just wasting time that's already running out? He turned on the TV, hoping to drown out the noise in his mind. A talk show was running a highlight from an Elon Musk speech. He was pacing a stage, hands moving like sparks, eyes alive. "There's this idea," Elon was saying, "that people have an expiration date. That innovation belongs to the young. But some of the best ideas come from people who've had time to think. Time to live. Time to fail." The audience clapped. Frank leaned forward, staring at the screen. Elon continued, "The brain doesn't stop being brilliant just because the hair turns gray. We need to stop assuming age means irrelevance. That mindset is a prison." Frank turned off the TV and sat in the silence. He let the words sink in, let them run through the cracks in his doubt. Time to live. Time to fail. Wasn't that him? He had lived. He had failed. But maybe, just maybe, he had also earned this second try. The next morning, he found the strength to lift the old metal frame of the prototype onto the table. It was heavier than he remembered. His shoulder screamed in protest. He stopped, breathed, then tried again. It scraped across the surface with a grating sound that felt like progress. He found a notepad and started jotting down what he could recall from the old schematics. The inverter needed better insulation. The battery chamber was inefficient. He had no clue if any of it still worked. But his hands were moving. His mind was active. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost. Later that afternoon, he walked to the drugstore. On the way back, he passed a group of teenagers sitting on their bikes outside the gas station. One of them snorted as Frank passed. "Look at this old dude. Got that scientist vibe." Frank smiled tightly and kept walking. The kids weren't trying to be mean. They just didn't see him. Not really. To them, he was just another old man with time to kill. If only they knew what was happening in his garage. If only he could explain it, that there was still something in him worth building. Something unfinished. That night, he created an anonymous account on a tech forum. He didn't want to use his real name. Not yet. He posted a photo of the blueprint and asked a question about battery cell arrangement. A few hours later, replies trickled in. Some helpful, some dismissive. One said, "You're probably over your head, but interesting concept." Frank smiled. He didn't mind. He was in the arena now. Trying. Failing. Asking. Building. The next morning, he opened the garage, looked around, and realized something had changed. Not in the tools. Not in the prototype. But in him. He had taken the first hit of doubt, the sting of invisibility, the skepticism of others, and kept going. He still didn't know where this was headed. Whether he could finish what he started. Whether anyone would care. But the war inside was shifting. The voices telling him to sit down, to fade away, were still there, but quieter now. And something stronger was rising in their place. He wasn't done. Not yet. He was just getting started. Frank Delaney didn't know what he was doing, but he was doing it anyway. He stood in his garage at 6:42 a.m., wearing the same faded flannel he had slept in, the collar uneven from where the washing machine had chewed it years ago. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the portable lantern, turned it on, and set it beside the old generator frame. He hadn't eaten yet. His coffee sat forgotten on the workbench, growing cold beside a grease-stained notebook filled with barely legible notes and half-finished diagrams. But he didn't care. Something was moving through him now. It wasn't confidence, he wasn't there yet, but it was motion, and motion was better than stillness. He had spent the last 2 days slowly disassembling the original prototype, documenting each part, checking each component, labeling old wires with masking tape and a Sharpie. The process was slower than it would have been years ago. His fingers cramped. His knees clicked. His reading glasses fogged up every time he leaned over the wiring harness. But he kept going. Every day. That morning, he sat on the small folding stool in the corner of the garage and stared at the frame, now stripped to its bare skeleton. It looked like something between a science fair project and a rusted-out lawnmower, but it still had a shape, a spirit, and most importantly, a future. For the first time in 3 decades, it wasn't just a forgotten idea in a plastic tub. It was a project again. And then it happened. He did something small. Something that would have seemed meaningless to anyone else but to him, it was a lightning bolt. He opened his laptop, logged into the anonymous tech forum where he'd posted his initial question, and started a thread called Rebuilding an Old Solar Generator at 73, Questions, Mistakes, and Progress. He hesitated before hitting post. He stared at the blinking cursor, his mind filling with doubt. What if no one responded? What if they laughed? What if someone figured out his age and dismissed him outright? He hovered over the button. Then he remembered that Elon quote again, the one he couldn't get out of his head: if something is important enough, even if the odds are against you, you should still do it. He pressed post. The screen blinked, the thread appeared, and he sat back in his chair with a long, shaky breath. Nothing exploded. The world didn't end. He was still there, still anonymous, still invisible, but somehow, more alive. He went back to work, stripping the old battery casing and noting down the voltage range. Around lunchtime, a notification popped up on his phone. Someone had replied. Then another. Then 3 more. He opened the thread. Cool idea. Any photos of the original? You building this to scale or just prototyping? Reminds me of my dad's ham radio shack. Keep posting updates. Frank's heart pounded. These weren't just strangers, they were people seeing him. Responding to him. He hadn't felt that in so long it was almost disorienting. That night, he couldn't sleep. Not because of fear this time, but because his brain wouldn't shut off. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, mentally mapping out new circuitry, wondering if he could retrofit a recycled lawnmower battery for storage, considering the logistics of converting the unit to USB-C output. At 2 a.m, he got up, shuffled into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of warm tap water, and opened his laptop again. A new comment had come in: would love to see a wiring diagram. I teach electrical engineering, happy to give thoughts. Frank stared at the screen. It felt like someone had just reached through the void and said, "You matter." He responded with shaky fingers, uploading a scanned image of his old schematic, apologizing for the chicken scratch handwriting. The professor replied 10 minutes later with a marked-up version, cleaner, annotated, with a few suggestions. One of them addressed an issue that had haunted Frank for years: why his original capacitor array kept shorting out. The professor explained it in 2 lines. Frank sat back in his chair and stared at the fix. He'd been trying to solve that problem since the late 90s. And now, because he had shared, because he had dared, he had the answer. The next morning, as sunlight filtered in through the garage window, Frank got to work with renewed focus. He began rebuilding the core assembly. He salvaged an old inverter casing from a junked RV battery he had stored in the shed, modified it to fit the updated specs, and drilled mounting holes with a trembling but determined hand. Each bolt he tightened felt like a declaration. Each wire he stripped felt like a reclaiming. He wasn't just building a generator anymore, he was rebuilding himself. Rebuilding the man who once believed he could do something that mattered. Rebuilding the version of himself that hadn't disappeared when Shirley passed, or when Mallory grew too busy to visit, or when the world stopped looking his way. That afternoon, Mallory called. She was in the car, Bluetooth on, engine humming in the background. "Hey Dad. Just checking in. How's your week been?" Frank wiped his hands on a rag, heart racing. He wanted to tell her. Wanted to say that he had posted on a forum, that engineers were responding, that he was fixing a 30-year-old mistake, that he felt like he'd just come back to life. But when he opened his mouth, something stopped him. A fear. A hesitation. The old ache of not being taken seriously. "Same old," he said instead. "Just puttering around." She exhaled, distracted again. "Glad to hear you're keeping busy. Love you, Dad." "Love you too." He ended the call and stared at the wall for a long moment, then whispered aloud to the empty room, "One day, I'll show you." He didn't mean it with bitterness. He meant it like a promise. That night, he opened YouTube. He hadn't used it much before, mostly for old car repair videos or classic country songs, but now he searched Elon Musk early interviews. He found one from 20 years ago, when Musk was in his 30s, talking awkwardly to a room of skeptical investors about electric cars and Mars. Frank watched the whole thing, captivated not by the polish but by the persistence. The guy wasn't polished. He stumbled over words, looked unsure, but he believed. And that belief was louder than any doubt. Frank clicked through more videos. Rockets exploding on launch. Dismissive journalists. Failure after failure. But Musk kept going. That was the part that stuck with Frank, not the genius, not the money, not the fame, but the stubbornness. The refusal to quit. The refusal to shrink. Frank closed the laptop and turned off the light. The garage was quiet, but not dead. It felt like a heart between beats. The next morning, he changed something else. He created an Instagram account. He called it @Retired and Rewired. He uploaded a photo of the generator frame with the caption, "Old project. New life." #solar build #not too late #tinkering at 73-inch. It got 4 likes. Then 10. Then a comment, "This is inspiring. My grandpa used to build stuff too." Frank stared at the screen for a long time. Not because of the attention, but because someone saw themselves in him. Maybe that was the point. Maybe this whole journey wasn't just about finishing the generator. Maybe it was about giving permission, first to himself, and maybe one day, to others. That evening, the wind picked up. A summer storm rolled in hard and fast. The lights in the house flickered. The TV cut out. Frank stood in the garage doorway and watched lightning fork across the sky. Power outage. He stepped back inside, reached for the small backup battery he'd been rigging, and plugged in the lantern. It lit up. Bright. Warm. Immediate. He laughed, really laughed, for the first time in a long time. Not because the light worked. Not because he'd solved it. But because he had started. That was the one thing that changed. He started. And everything else followed. It started with a flicker, then a buzz, and finally, light. Real light, not from the house, not from the grid, but from something Frank Delaney had built himself, with his own hands, using pieces from the past and courage from the present. He stood alone in his garage just after midnight, the summer storm long past, rainwater still dripping from the gutters. The house was still dark, but his workbench glowed in warm amber light powered by the solar generator that had once been just a forgotten dream in a plastic tub. He had done it. Not perfectly, not cleanly, not the way a young engineer might with pristine parts and a team of developers, but with grit and tenacity and a soldering iron that sparked twice before working. It wasn't a full system yet, just a proof of concept, but the lamp was on, and that small success hit him harder than any paycheck ever had. His hands trembled, not from age now, but from disbelief and joy. He let out a short laugh, the kind that broke out when pride overflowed into sound, then turned on his phone and recorded a shaky video of the moment. "I know it's just one light," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "but it's running on sunshine and stubbornness. I'm 73 years old, and I just proved something to myself." He uploaded the video to the same Instagram account, @retiredandrewired, along with a caption that read, "After 31 years of sitting on a shelf, the old solar generator breathes again. Never too late to finish what you started. #SolarPower #DIY #not too late #Elon Musk mindset." He didn't expect much. Maybe a few likes, maybe a stranger with a polite, "nice job." He went to bed with sore shoulders and a quiet heart, the kind of peace that only comes after doing something real. By morning, everything had changed. He woke up to 78 notifications. Then 220. Then more than he could count. People were sharing the video. Commenting. Liking. Tagging friends. There were notes from young engineering students, retirees, middle-aged dreamers who had shelved their own blueprints. "This made me cry," one comment read. "My dad used to build things like this. He never finished. Thank you for reminding me of him." Another said, "I'm 48 and afraid it's too late to start a business. This gives me hope." A third simply said, "I needed this today." Frank sat at his kitchen table, phone in one hand, mug in the other, staring at the screen like it might vanish. He had never gone viral. Didn't even really know what it meant. But the video had passed 10,000 views in 12 hours, and it wasn't slowing down. One comment caught his eye, "This is what the internet should be for. Anyone know how to reach this man? I want to feature him in my newsletter. I work with early inventors and tinkerers." Frank's throat tightened. He clicked the user's name, an engineer, just like the others. But this one had a small audience, a Substack, and hundreds of comments on his latest post about innovation in unlikely places. Frank replied with his email address before he could second-guess himself. 10 minutes later, the engineer emailed him. They set up a Zoom call for the next day. Frank didn't even remember how to use Zoom properly. He had to ask Greg, the neighbor, to help set it up. Greg came over, saw the workbench, and for the first time looked at it with something other than amusement. "You really did this?" he asked, pointing at the generator. "Yeah," Frank said, grinning. "Took me long enough." Greg whistled. "That's badass." It was a small word, a small moment, but it cracked something open in Frank. He hadn't been called anything badass in over 40 years. The next day, the Zoom call was awkward at first. Frank's camera was crooked, his face half in shadow, but the engineer didn't care. "We're launching a spotlight series called Makers of a Certain Age," the man explained. "You're the first person I thought of. What you're doing, it's bigger than the generator. It's about perseverance, legacy, and defiance. Would you be open to a short interview?" Frank nodded slowly, still trying to believe it. Sure. Yeah. Why not? The interview was short, maybe 15 minutes. Frank told the story of the blueprint on the napkin, of hiding the project, of Shirley's cautious encouragement and quiet resignation. He talked about losing the shop, losing his purpose, and how Elon's voice had hit him like a match in a dark room. He wasn't poetic. He stumbled over some words. Got choked up when talking about Mallory. But the engineer just nodded, listening carefully, then said, "This is gold." A week later, the article went live. The headline read, "73-year-old rebuilds his dream from scratch, and it still works." The article was shared over 20,000 times. It reached people in rural communities, small towns, urban apartments, retirement groups, and engineering programs. Frank got emails from all over the country. Some were short, just a "thank you" or "I showed this to my dad," but others were full stories of unfinished projects, lost confidence, and the courage to try again. One woman wrote, "I was going to throw away my paints after not touching them for 20 years. After seeing your post, I unpacked them instead." Another man wrote, "My father passed away last year. He left a notebook full of inventions. You made me want to build them in his honor." Frank cried reading that one. For a long time. Because that's when he realized this wasn't just about redemption, it was about resurrection. The part of him that had gone quiet after Shirley died, after the shop closed, after the world moved on without him, was awake now, fully awake. Mallory called later that day. She had seen the article. Her voice was different, brighter, more present. "Dad, why didn't you tell me you were doing all this?" Frank paused, wiping a tear. "I didn't think you'd care." "That's not fair," she said softly. "I care. I didn't know you still had this in you." He laughed gently. "I didn't either. Not until recently." There was a long silence between them, but not the kind that hurt. The kind that made room. "I'm proud of you," she said. "Dylan wants to come visit. He wants to see the solar machine, as he calls it." Frank's heart swelled. "I'd like that. I really would." That weekend, he cleaned the garage top to bottom, bought orange soda, Dylan's favorite, and even printed out the article to frame on the wall. When Mallory and Dylan arrived, Frank was already outside, wiping down the frame of the generator like it was a classic car. Dylan's eyes lit up when he saw it. "Is this it, Grandpa?" "This is it," Frank said proudly. "You want to help me test it?" The boy nodded eagerly. Frank handed him a small LED light and walked him through the process of plugging it into the inverter. The light blinked on. Dylan gasped. "It works." Frank laughed. "Told you." Mallory stood in the doorway watching, arms crossed, eyes glassy. Later, when Dylan was playing with some old wrenches on the bench, Mallory stepped up beside her father and said, "He thinks you're a wizard now." "I used to think I was one too," Frank said, smiling. "Then life got loud." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her, really looked, and said, "Now I think I'm just getting started." The next week, he got another email. This one from someone on a panel for a community innovation expo in the next county over. They had seen the article and wanted to know if he would be willing to bring the generator to the event. Frank's first reaction was fear. Him? At an expo? With engineers and inventors and tech startups? He was just a retired mechanic with a dream held together by duct tape and borrowed time. But the next morning, he responded with one word, yes. Because the breakthrough wasn't the working generator. It wasn't the viral post. It wasn't even the reconnection with his daughter. The breakthrough was inside. A belief reawakened. A voice that said, "You're not done. You never were." Frank Delaney had built a light that ran on sunlight. But more importantly, he had turned the light back on in himself. Frank Delaney stood in the middle of the Community Expo Center, a laminated name badge clipped to the collar of his denim work shirt, his rebuilt solar generator humming quietly on the table in front of him. Around him were booths with high-tech prototypes, glossy banners, and enthusiastic young founders in startup t-shirts pitching smart irrigation systems, drone software, and 3D printed prosthetics. Frank had a folding table, a handwritten sign, and a machine built from parts most people would have thrown away. He felt old. He felt out of place. And yet, somehow, he didn't feel small. For once, he didn't shrink. He watched as people passed his booth, slowing down, leaning in. Some asked questions. Some took photos. One man said, "You built this? Yourself?" Frank nodded. Started it in 1992. Finished it last month. The man laughed in amazement. That's incredible. A boy, maybe 11, stood in front of the generator with wide eyes. Does it really make electricity from the sun? Frank smiled. Sure does. Want to see? He handed the boy a small fan. The boy plugged it into the inverter and it whirred to life. His face lit up. Frank looked at the kid and saw something stir deep in his chest. Not pride exactly, something deeper. A sense of continuation. A thread being passed forward. As the boy ran back to his dad, Frank stood quietly, taking in the moment. All around him was progress, noise, movement. But what he had was history, and it mattered. One of the organizers stopped by near the end of the event. She was maybe in her 40s, confident, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Delaney, right?" she said. "We've been hearing a lot about your project." "Didn't know it was causing such a stir," Frank replied with a chuckle. "Well, it is. I actually wanted to ask, have you ever considered teaching? Mentoring?" Frank blinked. "Me?" "Yes, you," she said. "We run a local program for high schoolers interested in sustainable tech. You'd be amazing. They don't get to see many builders your age. You'd be the proof that ideas don't expire." Frank looked down at his hands. Rough. Calloused. A little shaky now. But still capable. "I don't have any formal degrees or anything," he said cautiously. She waved that off. "You've got something better. You finished something. You kept going. That's what they need to see." Frank didn't answer right away. He wasn't used to being asked to give anything other than a polite nod or a quiet step aside. But the idea lodged itself in his chest. What if the generator wasn't the end? What if it was just the first signal flare, the start of something bigger? That night, back at home, Frank sat at his kitchen table again, but this time with a notebook in front of him, not for technical sketches, but for ideas. Not for himself, but for others. He titled the page, "If I Had Known Then." Underneath, he began to write, small lessons, scraps of wisdom, short ideas he wished someone had told him when he was 17, or 35, or even 60. Things like, "Your worth doesn't retire when you do." And, "Don't wait for permission to build what calls to you." And, "It's okay to be afraid, just don't let it make decisions for you." The next morning, he emailed the organizer and said he'd be interested in mentoring. She replied within the hour with excitement, offering to set up a call with the school director. Frank smiled at the screen. It felt like a door opening that he hadn't known was there. Later that week, Mallory stopped by with Dylan. They brought lunch, sandwiches from the deli Frank used to take her to after Sunday church. She stayed longer than usual, helped him clean out the garage, laughed at some of the junk he refused to throw away, and then spotted the notebook on his workbench. "What's this?" she asked, flipping it open. Frank hesitated, then said, "Just some thoughts. For the kids I'll be working with." Mallory raised her eyebrows. "You're working with kids now?" "Maybe," he said. "They asked me to speak. Mentor." Share the project. She flipped through the pages again, this time slower. This is, really good, Dad. It's just notes, he said, feeling a little embarrassed. No. It's more than that, she said. You've got something people need. Especially now. That evening, after they left, Frank sat in the garage as the light faded. The rebuilt generator stood steady in the corner, quiet now but solid, like a foundation. He looked around at the space, once cluttered with old tools and dust, now filled with purpose again. And for the first time, he let himself really ask the question he'd been afraid to ask since all of this began: what now? Not in the sense of anxiety or doubt, but wonder. Because something had shifted deep inside him, not just about the machine, or his age, or even the response from the world, but about the idea of legacy. For so long he'd believed legacy was about what you leave behind when you die. A name on a headstone. A memory in someone's drawer. But now he saw it differently. Legacy was what you passed forward while you were still here. It was the courage to share what you'd learned, even if your voice shook. It was the willingness to show someone younger that it's okay to start over. It was using your story, not as a badge of shame, but as a map for someone else. And suddenly, it made sense why Elon Musk had struck such a chord with him. It wasn't just the ambition, or the inventions, or the audacity. It was the refusal to accept limits, not just external ones, but internal ones. Musk had failed, stumbled, been laughed at, but he never let the world's opinion override his belief. And Frank realized now that he had spent too many years letting other people's silence write his story. But not anymore. Now, he was holding the pen. The next week, he gave his first talk at the school. He stood in front of a group of 12 students in a fluorescent-lit classroom, the generator beside him, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He wasn't slick. He didn't have a slideshow. But he told the truth. About the napkin blueprint. About the 30 years of waiting. About the fear of being forgotten. And about the moment, one late night in a dark garage, when he chose to start again. One girl raised her hand and asked, "Weren't you scared people would think you were crazy? Like, too old or something?" Frank laughed gently. "I was terrified. But I realized something: if I waited for the fear to go away, I'd never begin. So I just started scared." After the talk, the teacher pulled him aside. "You should come back," she said. "They were glued to you." Frank nodded, his throat tight. On the way home, he took the long route, through the old part of town, past the shop where he used to work, past the church, past the cemetery where Shirley was buried. He stopped the car, got out, and walked slowly to her headstone. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, wind tugging gently at his sleeves. "I finished it," he said aloud. "Took me a while, huh?" The wind rustled the trees. He smiled. "You'd laugh if you saw all this. Me, giving talks. Kids asking questions. People online thinking I'm some kind of pioneer." He crouched down, ran his hand along the edge of the stone. "But it's not about the machine. Not really. It's about proving to myself that I wasn't done. That I still had something to give." He stood again, looking out over the grass, then whispered, "And I think I still do." That night, back at home, Frank opened a new notebook. This one he titled, "The Second Wind Project." A place for ideas. Talks. Questions to ask students. Workshop outlines. Maybe even a book someday. Not for fame. Not for money. But because if even one person saw his story and thought, "Maybe it's not too late for me either," then everything, every failure, every year in silence, every spark of doubt, had been worth it. Frank Delaney had once believed his life had passed him by. That at 70, he had become invisible. But now, he understood something simple and profound: it was never about the years. It was always about what you did with them. And for the first time in a long time, the road ahead looked wide open. It started with one student. A lanky sophomore named Jordan who showed up after Frank's second mentorship session with a notebook full of sketches and questions too fast for even the shop teacher to keep up with. Jordan asked if Frank would take a look at his homemade wind turbine model, then apologized because it's kind of janky. Frank looked at the kid and said, "Don't ever apologize for trying something new. Janky just means it's in progress." That moment stayed with Frank. It reminded him of who he was at 16, dreaming of ideas bigger than his toolbox, unsure how to begin, afraid to get laughed at. Over the next few weeks, more students started showing up. Some stayed after class to ask about solar cells or battery storage. Some brought their own projects, small, crude, beautiful in their imperfection. Frank saw himself in each of them. And more than that, he began to see the point of it all. The generator had been a symbol. A catalyst. But this? This was the work. Helping others believe again. Not long after, the school principal invited Frank to a staff meeting and asked if he'd consider helping them design a hands-on sustainability elective for the following semester. "We want to build something real," the principal said. "Not just worksheets. Not just theory. Projects that work. Projects with purpose. And frankly, you're the reason these kids think they can do it." Frank felt the weight of that statement and accepted without hesitation. He started spending 2 mornings a week at the school. The students called him Mr. D, and built everything from small solar lamps to thermal cookers from old pizza boxes. And every time a project lit up or turned on or moved under its own power, he saw the look on their faces, that combination of wonder and ownership, and it filled something in him he hadn't realized was still empty. Around the same time, his online following began to grow quietly but steadily. More people found his video. Some emailed him. A woman in Idaho who ran a retirement home asked if he'd consider doing a virtual talk for her residents. He said yes and spent 30 minutes answering questions from a group of seniors who hadn't felt inspired in years. One man said, "You made me want to dig out my old typewriter and start the novel I gave up on in '88. Frank blinked back tears. It hit him differently when it came from someone his age. Not because it meant more, but because it meant that hope wasn't just for the young. That week, he made a new video, short one, no edits, just him sitting in his garage, looking into the camera with those tired, kind eyes. He said, "I used to think there was a moment in life when the world stops listening to you. Like your voice just fades into the background after a certain age. But maybe it's not about the world listening. Maybe it's about you speaking anyway. Loud enough to wake yourself up." That clip was shared more than the first one. He didn't try to go viral. It just happened. Elon Musk himself didn't comment, but someone from one of his companies shared the clip with the caption, "We need more Franks." Frank saw that late one night and just sat in his garage, phone in hand, heart pounding, not because of the attention, but because somehow, without knowing it, he had crossed a bridge between his world and theirs. He wasn't invisible anymore. One morning, while sweeping the sawdust out of the garage, Mallory stopped by unannounced. She had coffee and a bag of warm croissants. Frank raised an eyebrow. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," she said. "Just, wanted to hang out. Also," she added, pulling something from her purse, "this came in the mail at my place. Think it's for you." It was a letter, handwritten, thick envelope, a wax seal on the back. Frank opened it slowly. Inside was a short message from a professor at a university in Oregon who had read about Frank's project in a sustainability blog. The professor ran an intergenerational innovation conference and wanted to invite Frank to be a keynote speaker for their fall session. "Your story has become a teaching tool," the letter said. "We'd be honored to have you share it with our students." Frank stared at the page, heart pounding. "They want me to speak. At a university." Mallory's smile was quiet and proud. "Told you the world was watching, Dad." That night, he sat at his desk, notebook open, trying to figure out what to say to a room full of engineers and dreamers, some older than him, most much younger. He thought about his story, about the 30-year silence, about Shirley's quiet belief, about Elon Musk's relentless mind, and about that first light bulb glowing in the middle of a dark stormy night. He started writing not a speech, but a letter, one addressed to anyone who ever felt their time had passed. It began, "You were never too old. You were just waiting for someone to remind you that your fire was still burning." He didn't want to preach. He just wanted to prove by his life that it wasn't over, not until you decided it was. When he gave the speech 3 weeks later, he wore a button-down shirt Mallory had ironed for him and stood at a wooden podium with his rebuilt generator humming quietly beside him. The audience was quiet at first. Then they leaned in. By the end, they were on their feet. He wasn't flashy. He didn't use slides. He just told the truth. Afterward, a young woman in the front row came up to him with tears in her eyes. "My grandfather was an inventor," she said. "But he gave up after my grandmother died. I think if he saw you, he might have tried again." Frank hugged her. Not out of politeness, but because her words cracked something open again, the same way they always did when he realized that maybe the real invention, the real power, wasn't the machine at all. It was the reminder. That night, back home, Frank looked around his garage and saw it differently. Not just as a place of tools and workbenches, but as a lighthouse. A place where something once lost had been found again. And now that he'd been found, he wasn't going back to the shadows. He wrote on his whiteboard, "The goal is no longer to be heard. The goal is to remind others they still have a voice." Mallory called the next morning. She wanted to bring Dylan over again, but this time she asked, "Do you think he could build something with you?" Frank grinned. "You bet he can." The two of them built a small solar-powered nightlight that weekend. Dylan called it "Sunshine in a Box." Frank let him draw flames on the casing with permanent marker. "It's our first product," he said proudly. Mallory filmed the whole thing, posted it online, and within 2 days, someone commented, "I'd buy that." Frank laughed when he saw it. But the comment stuck. Later that night, he sat with Dylan on the porch and said, "Maybe one day, you and I will start a company together." Dylan looked up at him with wide eyes. "Really? Why not?" Frank replied. "You've already got the creativity. I've got the stubbornness. That's all a company really needs." And in that moment, watching the boy's face glow with excitement, Frank felt something powerful settle into his bones. It wasn't just about finishing a forgotten invention anymore. It was about building a future, one spark at a time. One person at a time. The world had started watching. But more importantly, Frank had started living. Again. On purpose. The emails came faster now. Journalists asking for interviews. A podcast producer wanting Frank to be a guest on a series about second acts in life. A company in Austin requesting permission to reprint his story in their employee newsletter. Every morning Frank poured himself a mug of black coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened his inbox like it was a puzzle he didn't quite know how to solve. Some messages made him smile. A man in Maine who said, "My brother and I are finishing our father's old radio tower because of you." A woman in Georgia who wrote, "I've been in hospice care for 2 years. I didn't think I had anything left to look forward to. Then I saw your video and decided to take apart an old fan and rebuild it, just to see if I still could." But others felt like expectations he hadn't signed up for. Invitations. Business opportunities. Requests for advice. "What should I do with my dad's old schematics? Can I send you my solar prototype for feedback? Will you consult on our project?" Frank tried to respond to everyone, but it started to wear on him. He had built one machine. That's all. He wasn't an expert. He wasn't a guru. He was just a guy who finally decided to stop waiting. One evening, as the sun slipped below the rooftops, he sat alone in his garage and stared at the workbench. Tools where they belonged. Notebooks stacked neatly. The generator, now affectionately called the old sun dog, stood in its corner like a reliable friend. But Frank felt something tighten in his chest. That old familiar voice creeping back in. You got lucky. Don't embarrass yourself now. You're not young enough to keep up with all this. He rubbed his temples and sighed. It was easier when no one expected anything. When it was just him, a soldering iron, and a blueprint from another life. Now there were eyes on him. People who thought he had it all figured out. But he didn't. Not really. He still had doubts. Still missed Shirley so much it hurt. Still looked in the mirror and saw a man older than he felt, with a body slower than his ideas. That night, he didn't write in his notebook. Didn't check his messages. Just sat on the back porch under the stars and let himself feel small again. The next morning, Mallory called. You okay? She asked. You've been quiet. Frank hesitated. Just tired, I guess. Dad, she said gently. You know you don't owe anyone anything, right? You don't have to say yes to everyone. You don't have to fix the whole world. He let her words settle. I know, he said. It's just, they're looking to me like I'm something I'm not. You're something to them, she replied. You're proof. That it's not too late. That starting over means something. That finishing matters. He was quiet for a long time. Then finally said, sometimes I feel like I've only just caught my breath. And now everyone wants me to run a marathon. She laughed softly. Then walk. Let them see you walk. Let them know that's okay too. Frank thought about that. Maybe he didn't have to do it all. Maybe the power wasn't in being invincible, it was in being honest. The next day, he made another video. This time he sat in his living room, the light soft, the air quiet. I've been getting a lot of messages, he said into the camera. People thanking me, asking for help, sharing their stories. And I want to say, I'm honored. Really. But I'm not special. I'm not a genius. I didn't do anything magic. I just said yes to something I'd been saying no to for too long. And I got scared. I still get scared. But I keep going, even when I feel like I can't. That's the part one hope you hear. Not the machine. Not the views. But the choice. To begin again. No matter how long you've waited. He posted the video and closed the app. Didn't look at numbers. Didn't refresh. Just went to the garage and picked up his tools. That week, he started a new project with the students. A solar charging station for bikes. They sketched it on the whiteboard together, argued over materials, tested different configurations. Frank watched them work and felt the weight begin to lift. Not because the pressure was gone, but because he remembered why he was doing this in the first place. Not for followers. Not for attention. But for the kid who didn't believe he was smart enough. For the man who thought his best days were behind him. For the woman who hadn't touched a tool in 30 years. For himself. Because even now, the doubt still crept in. The nights were still quiet. The ache still showed up in the morning. But he was building something that pushed back against the silence. One connection at a time. One lesson at a time. One voice reminding the others, you're not done. The following month, he was invited to be on a panel at an innovation festival. The other speakers were younger, sharper, full of big words and polished slides. Frank stood there with his hands in his pockets and said, I don't know much about algorithms or venture capital. But I know what it feels like to think you've missed your moment. And I know what it feels like to realize that moment is still waiting for you. If you're willing to look again. The audience didn't clap right away. They sat there, thinking. Then the room erupted. One woman in the crowd shouted, "That's what we needed to hear." And just like that, the doubt shrank again. Not gone. Just smaller. After the event, a young reporter followed him outside. She asked, "What do you think is the hardest part about getting older?" Frank thought for a second, then said, "The hardest part is not being forgotten by others. It's forgetting yourself. Forgetting that you still matter. That you still have a say in who you are." She wrote that down. Then asked, "And the best part?" He smiled. "You don't care so much what people think anymore. You just care about the few things that really matter. That's freedom." She thanked him, walked away, and Frank stood under the sky again, that same sky he had looked at 100 times with doubt in his chest. But now, it felt like something had changed. Not the sky. Not the world. Just him. He had let the light in, and it had stayed. Faint some days. Bright others. But always there. Waiting for the next person to see it. It was a Monday morning when Frank's world felt like it tilted all over again. He had just finished setting up the prototype for the solar bike charging station at the high school when Principal Harris walked into the garage with a serious look that immediately tightened Frank's chest. "Frank," Harris began, "we need to talk about the funding for your program. The school board has concerns." Frank's stomach sank. He had heard whispers before, but hearing it so directly felt like a punch. "Concerns?" Frank asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes," Harris said carefully. "They say the money might be better spent on standardized test prep or other core subjects. They're questioning whether hands-on projects and mentorships like yours really justify the budget." Frank swallowed hard. It wasn't just about money, it was about being dismissed again. Like all the years he'd spent trying to prove something, suddenly meaningless. He looked at the partially assembled solar station, at the scribbled notes and worn tools, and felt the old familiar heaviness of invisibility creep back in. That night, he sat alone in his garage under the flickering light, staring at the blueprints he'd drawn with Jordan and Dylan. He remembered Shirley's voice from long ago, "Keep building, no matter what." But what if this time, the world really had turned its back? What if he was fooling himself again? The next day, Frank called Mallory. Her voice was warm but concerned. "Dad, you've got to fight this. You've built something real. You've already changed lives. But what if they're right?" Frank admitted quietly. "Maybe this is just a hobby. Maybe I'm too old to make a difference." Mallory's pause was gentle but firm. "You're not too old. You're just facing resistance. And that means you're on the right track." Frank clenched his jaw. Resistance wasn't new, but it still hurt. He decided to attend the school board meeting that Thursday. The room was colder than the garage, full of suits and faces that seemed distant and impatient. When it was his turn to speak, Frank stood up, shoulders back, heart pounding. "I'm not here to argue budgets," he began. "I'm here because these kids, these young people, need more than tests. They need hope. They need to build. To fail. To try again. I was once told my best years were behind me. But that's not true. Not for me, not for them, and not for any of us. If you take this away, you're telling them, and me, that it's time to stop dreaming." There was silence. Then murmurs. A board member leaned forward and asked, "Mr. D, do you have any evidence that your program improves academic performance?" Frank nodded. "I do. But more importantly, it improves belief. Belief in themselves. And sometimes, that's the first step toward everything else." After the meeting, Frank left with no promises. Just a feeling that maybe he'd done what he could. But inside, the doubt whispered louder than ever. That night, a social media backlash erupted. A few comments dismissed Frank as a retired tinkerer, wasting taxpayer money. Some accused him of clinging to irrelevant dreams. The word stung. He considered deleting his profiles, shutting down his emails, retreating back into the shadows. But then he remembered Elon Musk's interview, the one where Elon said, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Frank realized this wasn't just about him. It was about every voice pushed down by fear and doubt. So he wrote a new post. This time, raw and unpolished. "Today, the world reminded me I'm old. That some think I don't belong here. But I remember something Elon Musk said about trying anyway, no matter the odds. I'm not done. Not yet. And if you're feeling ignored, like your time has passed, join me. Let's keep building. Together." The post didn't go viral. But it was shared by people who mattered, the students, the teachers, the families who had been touched quietly by his work. The real victory was quiet but real. The next day, Jordan showed up with a big grin and a new sketch. "I'm not giving up either," he said. "Neither am I," Frank replied. Mallory visited and brought Dylan. The three of them sat around the workbench, fingers sticky with glue and eyes bright with possibility. Frank felt a shift inside. It was still hard. The world still doubted him. But now, the fight felt different. It wasn't just about proving others right or wrong. It was about proving to himself that his story wasn't over. That the spark Elon Musk had ignited inside him was a fire, one that no setback could extinguish. The days ahead were uncertain, but Frank wasn't afraid anymore. Because he had learned something essential, the power wasn't in never failing. It was in getting up, every time, and starting again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The phone call came on a crisp Tuesday morning. Frank was in his kitchen, the sun filtering through the window and casting warm light on the faded countertop where he'd spent countless hours sketching, building, dreaming. The voice on the other end was from a producer at a popular national radio show, a show known for highlighting stories of resilience, reinvention, and grit. "Mr. D, we'd love to have you share your story on the program. Your message is inspiring a lot of people, and we want to give you a bigger platform." Frank stared at the receiver, heart pounding. This was the moment where his life could change again. Or maybe it could all come crashing down. The excitement tangled with nerves, but this time he felt ready. This time, he knew he had a story worth telling. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Frank wrote and rewrote what he wanted to say, trying to capture everything he'd learned, the fear, the failure, the small victories, and the people who believed in him. Mallory helped him practice, patiently listening as he stumbled over words, then encouraging him with a smile. "You don't have to be perfect," she reminded him. "Just be real." When the day of the interview arrived, Frank dressed carefully in his best shirt and headed to the radio station's small but bustling studio. The producer greeted him warmly, making the room feel less intimidating. When the microphone went live, Frank took a deep breath and spoke from the heart. He told the story of his life before 70, of regrets, lost opportunities, and feeling invisible. He shared how Elon Musk's words had sparked something inside him, pushing him to take a chance on himself again. He described the solar bike charging station, the students who had become like family, and the message he hoped to send to anyone who felt they'd been left behind. "It's never too late," he said. "Not to learn, not to build, not to change." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Calls and messages poured in from around the country, people sharing their own stories, thanking Frank for reminding them they still mattered. Invitations to speak at events, to consult on community projects, even offers to collaborate on new inventions came flooding his inbox. But with the new attention came new pressures. Suddenly, Frank was expected to be an expert, a spokesperson, a symbol of aging with purpose. Some days the weight of those expectations felt crushing. He struggled to balance the spotlight with the simple joy of creating in his garage. He missed the quiet moments where it was just him and the workbench, free from cameras and questions. One afternoon, as he worked on an upgraded solar panel design, Mallory found him staring blankly at a tangle of wires and circuits. "You okay, Dad?" she asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's like the more people expect from me, the less sure I feel about what I'm doing." Mallory nodded knowingly. "Remember when you told me the power is in being honest? Maybe that means being honest about feeling overwhelmed, too." Her words gave him permission to slow down. To be human. To not have all the answers. Frank realized he didn't have to carry the whole movement on his shoulders. The real change came in small, imperfect steps taken together. So he began to share not just his successes but his struggles, posting videos of messy projects, of days when things didn't work, of moments when he wanted to quit. The response was more powerful than he expected. People connected with his honesty. They sent messages saying, "Thank you for being real," and, "It helps me keep going when I see you struggle too." Frank's story was no longer just about building machines, it was about building community. About showing that transformation wasn't a clean line but a winding path filled with setbacks and triumphs. As spring turned to summer, Frank found a rhythm that worked. He spoke at local schools and community centers, hosted small workshops in his garage, and continued collaborating with the students on new projects. He even started a modest newsletter, sharing ideas, tips, and stories from others who were embracing change later in life. One evening, as he sat on the porch with Mallory and Dylan, watching fireflies flicker in the twilight, Frank felt a deep sense of peace. The journey wasn't over, and the challenges weren't gone. But he was no longer afraid of the future. He had learned that the light wasn't just about being seen, it was about seeing yourself as worthy, capable, and alive at every age. And that made all the difference. Frank had always believed that the past was a place best left undisturbed. Memories of Shirley, of lost years, and missed chances lived quietly in the back of his mind, like a worn photograph tucked away in a drawer. But sometimes the past had a way of breaking through, demanding attention. One afternoon, as he was tidying up the garage, the phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, and when he answered, a hesitant voice said, "Mr. D? This is Lisa Harper, Shirley's niece." Frank's breath caught. Lisa explained that Shirley's sister had recently passed, and there were some belongings from Shirley's old studio apartment that needed sorting. "I thought you might want some of them," Lisa said gently. Frank hesitated, then agreed. That weekend, Lisa arrived with boxes filled with yellowed notebooks, letters, and old photographs. As Frank carefully unfolded a faded letter, he felt the past come alive. The handwriting was Shirley's, her words full of hope and dreams they once shared. But then he found a journal entry dated just months before she passed, a page filled with frustration and fear, doubts about their future and about him. The pain was sharp but familiar. He realized he had never truly processed her doubts or the way her illness had changed everything between them. That night, Frank sat alone with the journal, reading through her words, feeling the weight of years of silence between them. For the first time, he allowed himself to mourn not just Shirley's passing, but the loss of the life they might have had. The next morning, he called Mallory and told her about the journals. "I didn't know she felt that way," he said quietly. "I thought we were both just surviving." Mallory listened, her voice soft. "Maybe it's time to tell your story differently. Not just the story of building, but the story of healing. Of facing what was left unsaid." Inspired, Frank began to write again. Not about inventions or projects, but about love and loss, regrets and forgiveness. He shared his reflections on social media, and the response was immediate. People reached out with their own stories of loss, of relationships fractured by time or pain, and of the possibility of reconciliation, even if just within themselves. Frank realized that his journey wasn't just about proving his worth or building machines, it was about reclaiming his whole self. One afternoon, at a community event, a woman approached him. "I saw your posts about Shirley," she said, and it reminded me of my own mother. I just want to say thank you for being brave enough to share that." The encounter was a quiet moment of connection that filled Frank's heart. Later that evening, as he sat by the window watching the rain, he thought about Elon Musk's words from a recent interview: "The hardest challenges often come wrapped in opportunity." Frank knew now that facing his past wasn't a setback, it was a step forward. It was part of the change he needed to fully embrace life again. Frank felt a quiet shift inside as he stepped into the community center that crisp autumn morning. The room buzzed with a mix of anticipation and nerves. Dozens of faces, mostly people his age or older, gathered for a workshop titled "Reinventing Life After 70." Frank glanced around, seeing the same questions in their eyes that he once carried. Questions about relevance, about worth, about what came next. As he took the microphone, his voice steady but warm, he shared not just his inventions or his newfound public attention, but the deeper journey he'd been on. The loss of Shirley, the healing through honesty, and the small sparks of hope that had kept him going. "We're not just rebuilding projects or habits," he said. "We're rebuilding ourselves. And that takes courage." Hands raised. Stories poured out, of spouses lost, dreams deferred, children distant, health challenges. Frank listened, connecting their struggles with his own. He felt the power in the room, the collective experience, the shared resilience. It reminded him of Elon Musk's insistence on tackling big problems head-on, no matter the obstacles. Here, in this modest room, the problem was not rockets or electric cars, but loneliness, fear, and invisibility in a society that seemed to value youth above all else. After the workshop, a small group stayed behind. They talked late into the afternoon about starting a community makerspace, somewhere older adults could come, learn, create, and mentor younger generations. Frank's heart swelled with the possibility. This was more than a workshop. It was a movement. Over the coming weeks, Frank threw himself into organizing the space. He met with local officials, rallied volunteers, and secured a donated building, a former library branch that had been empty for years. Every brick laid and every tool donated was a symbol of hope and renewal. One evening, as he unlocked the doors to the new makerspace for the first time, Frank paused. The room smelled of fresh paint and sawdust, a promise of things to come. He thought about Elon Musk's relentless vision, about how the great innovators never stopped pushing boundaries, no matter the setbacks or critics. Frank wasn't building rockets or electric cars, but he was building something just as vital, a place where life could be reinvented, where age was not a limit but a foundation. The grand opening was a small affair but filled with laughter and applause. People who had felt forgotten found a new home. They shared stories, taught each other skills, and discovered joy in creation. Frank watched as a group of teenagers and seniors worked side by side on a robotics project, their differences bridged by shared purpose. One afternoon, Mallory came by with Dylan in tow. Dylan, eyes wide, asked Frank, "Grandpa, how did you do all this?" Frank smiled, feeling the weight of years lift in that moment. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "Sometimes, all it takes is one spark, and a whole lot of people willing to keep the fire burning." As the days turned into months, Frank's story spread. Not because of fame or media, but because of the quiet, persistent power of community. He realized that the true legacy wasn't in what he built alone, but in what they built together. In the faces of the people who found new purpose and friendship, Frank found his own. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in decades, Frank knew he was exactly where he needed to be. Just as the makerspace was beginning to hum with life and laughter, an unexpected challenge loomed on the horizon. It was a chilly morning when Frank received the letter, official, stamped, and unmistakably serious. The city planned to sell the building to a private developer. The community center, the makerspace, the dream they had all built together, was at risk of being torn down to make way for luxury condos. Frank's hands trembled as he read and reread the notice. It felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling. He thought about the faces of the people who came here every day, those who found hope in hammering nails, programming robots, or simply sharing a cup of coffee. Losing this place would be like losing a part of himself, a part of everyone who had dared to believe they still mattered. At the next community meeting, the mood was heavy with disbelief and fear. Some talked of giving up, others of fighting back. Frank stood before them, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "This isn't just a building," he said, voice firm despite the turmoil inside. "It's a symbol of what we can do when we refuse to be ignored. We have to fight for it. Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been told they're too old to matter." The group rallied, organizing petitions, contacting local representatives, and planning peaceful protests. Frank found himself speaking at city council meetings, sharing stories about how the makerspace had changed lives and why it needed to stay. The fight was exhausting and often discouraging. At one meeting, a council member dismissed their cause as a nice hobby, but not a priority. Frank felt the sting of invisibility all over again, but he refused to let it break him. Instead, he remembered Elon Musk's persistence, how Musk faced repeated failures and criticism but kept pushing forward, fueled by a vision bigger than the setbacks. Drawing on that example, Frank kept the community focused on hope and action. Slowly, their efforts began to gain attention. Local newspapers ran stories, and social media campaigns spread their message far beyond the city limits. Volunteers from neighboring towns came to show support. The makerspace became more than a local project. It became a symbol of resilience for anyone who had ever been written off. One night, after a particularly long day, Frank sat alone in the empty makerspace. The silence was almost deafening. He touched the worn wood of the workbench and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Doubt crept in like a shadow. Was this fight worth it? Could they really save the place? Just then, his phone buzzed with a message from Mallory. "Remember this?" it read, followed by a clip from an Elon Musk interview. "When you're trying to do something important, you have to be willing to fail a lot. But every failure brings you closer to success." Frank smiled, feeling the familiar spark reignite inside him. The next day, armed with renewed determination, he stood at the city council hearing. The room was packed with supporters holding signs and sharing stories. Frank spoke from the heart, telling the story of the makerspace and the people who had found new purpose there. When the council voted to delay the sale and form a committee to explore alternatives, the room erupted in cheers. It wasn't a final victory, but it was a step forward. In the weeks that followed, Frank and the committee worked tirelessly, meeting with city officials, developers, and community leaders to find a way to preserve the makerspace. It was a delicate balance of negotiation and advocacy, requiring patience and resilience. Throughout the struggle, Frank saw the community grow stronger. People who once felt isolated found connection and purpose in the fight. He realized that sometimes, the greatest change came not from winning battles easily, but from standing firm in the face of uncertainty. One evening, as Frank walked home under a sky heavy with stars, he reflected on how far he'd come, from feeling ignored and invisible to leading a movement that touched lives. The fight wasn't over, but he understood now that the real victory was in never giving up. The makerspace was more than a place, it was a testament to the power of hope, community, and the courage to keep building, no matter the storm. The late summer sun poured through the dusty windows of the makerspace as Frank sat alone at the workbench, fingers tracing the rough edges of a half-finished project. The weight of the fight to save the building pressed down on him heavier than ever. Meetings, phone calls, and public appearances had become his new routine, but the exhaustion ran deeper than his bones. Some nights, when the house was quiet and the world felt far away, doubt crept in like a slow, cold tide. He wondered if he was really the person everyone thought he was, the leader, the inspiration. Maybe they were all just fooling themselves. Mallory noticed the change before Frank admitted it aloud. "You're carrying too much, Dad," she said one evening as she set a cup of tea beside him. "You don't have to do this alone." But Frank felt like he couldn't let go. The makerspace was more than bricks and mortar, it was a beacon for everyone who'd been told their time had passed. If he stepped back now, what would happen? The community, the kids, the dream, they needed him. Still, the pressure gnawed at his spirit. At a city council meeting, a young developer took the podium and dismissed their cause as sentimental and impractical, arguing the property would bring more money and growth as condos. The room's temperature seemed to drop. Frank felt every eye turn toward him. He cleared his throat and stood, heart pounding. Growth isn't just about buildings, he said slowly. It's about people. About giving everyone, no matter their age, a chance to belong, to create, to contribute. His words echoed in the silence, met with polite applause but no clear answer. That night, Frank lay awake, replaying the exchange. Was he fighting an impossible battle? Was it foolish to think a place like the makerspace could compete with progress defined by profits? In the weeks that followed, Frank's health began to falter. The constant stress awakened old pains, his back ached more, sleep came in restless fragments, and a persistent fatigue settled in his bones. His doctor's words echoed in his mind, "You need to slow down, Frank. This pace isn't sustainable." But slowing down felt like surrender. One afternoon, Mallory found him dozing in a chair, hands still clutching a stack of paperwork. She sat beside him gently. "Dad, you're not a machine. You need to rest." The conversation cracked open a truth Frank hadn't faced: he was running on empty. The vision that had carried him so far was now at risk if he didn't take care of himself. That evening, he pulled out his old journal, the one he'd started when he first found the courage to change. Flipping through pages filled with sketches, ideas, and memories, he found a quote he'd written months ago, inspired by Elon Musk: "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." But now he saw a balance he'd missed: doing something important also meant being sustainable, protecting the fire instead of burning it out. The next day, Frank called a meeting with the Corps volunteers and spoke honestly. "I've been pushing too hard, trying to carry this alone," he admitted. "But this isn't about me. It's about all of us. I need your help, not just with the makerspace, but with me." The group rallied around him, sharing responsibilities and reminding him that leadership was about trust and community, not solo heroics. Slowly, Frank learned to delegate, to rest, and to accept support. He realized that the strength of the movement wasn't in any one person, but in the collective passion and commitment. As fall deepened, the battle to save the makerspace continued, but Frank faced it renewed, with a clearer mind and steadier heart. The storm was far from over, but he was no longer carrying it alone. And in that shared struggle, he found a new kind of strength, one built not just on willpower, but on connection, resilience, and hope. The air had a crisp edge as autumn settled deeper into the town, painting the trees with fiery hues. Inside the makerspace, the hum of activity filled the room, people crafting, sharing, learning, and building bonds that transcended age. Frank watched quietly from his usual spot near the window, heart swelling with quiet pride. Just when the fight to save their beloved space felt like a constant uphill climb, an unexpected email arrived that would shift the course of their struggle. It was from a local tech entrepreneur named Rachel Simmons, someone Frank had briefly met at a city event. She had been following their story and saw something worth investing in, not just financially, but in spirit. Rachel proposed a partnership. Her startup wanted to collaborate with the makerspace on a program to teach coding and robotics to older adults and young people alike, blending innovation with intergenerational learning. Frank stared at the screen, disbelief mingling with hope. Could this be the breakthrough they needed? At their next community meeting, Rachel spoke passionately about her vision. "We want to prove that innovation isn't just for the young," she said. "The wisdom and experience of your community, combined with the energy and tech skills of younger generations, that's a formula for true creativity." The room buzzed with excitement and skepticism alike. Some worried the makerspace mission might be diluted or commercialized. Others saw the opportunity to reach new people and resources. Frank weighed the risks but knew they needed this boost. We have to be careful to stay true to who we are, he told the group, but this could be the kind of partnership that helps us survive, and thrive. Over the following weeks, preparations began. Rachel's team brought in laptops, robotics kits, and instructors. Classes filled quickly, bridging the generational gap in unexpected ways. Frank watched as a grandmother named Helen teamed up with a teenager named Marcus to build a drone prototype. Their laughter and determination filled the room, a testament to the power of connection. Yet, amid the excitement, the threat of losing the building still loomed large. The developers were pushing harder, and negotiations with the city remained uncertain. One afternoon, after a class ended, Rachel pulled Frank aside. "There's another option," she said quietly. "My company is looking to expand its headquarters, and they've been scouting sites. They like this location. If we could work out a deal to buy the building, the makerspace could have a permanent home, and maybe even grow." The possibility stunned Frank. Ownership would mean security, freedom, and a legacy. But the price was steep, and raising funds seemed daunting. Rachel assured him they could launch a crowdfunding campaign and seek grants. "People will rally around a story like yours," she said. Inspired, Frank agreed to lead the effort, igniting a new wave of energy in the community. They created videos, shared testimonials, and spread their message far and wide. Donations trickled in at first, then surged. Stories of people rediscovering purpose, bridging divides, and defying age barriers struck a chord. Even skeptics began to believe. But with opportunity came new challenges. Managing the fundraising, coordinating volunteers, and balancing the daily work of the makerspace tested Frank's limits. He leaned on Mallory and the core team more than ever, remembering the lessons he'd learned about shared leadership. One evening, as he updated their campaign numbers, Frank felt a familiar knot of anxiety. Would they raise enough? Could they really pull this off? Then his phone buzzed with a message from Dylan, who had been quiet but deeply proud. "Grandpa, I'm helping too. We can do this." Frank smiled, the warmth of family and community fueling his resolve. The campaign became more than a fundraiser, it was a movement, a declaration that age was not an end, but a beginning. Weeks later, standing in the same room that had once felt fragile and uncertain, Frank announced that they had reached their goal. The makerspace would be theirs to keep. Cheers and tears filled the air. That night, Frank reflected on how far they'd come, from being ignored and dismissed to owning a future they had shaped themselves. He thought about Elon Musk's boldness, his refusal to accept limits, and realized that the spark Elon had lit in him was now burning brightly in many hearts. The storm was not over, there would be new battles, new challenges, but Frank was ready. Together, they had opened a door to a future where age was no barrier, only a part of the story. Owning the makerspace felt like a dream come true, yet as the keys settled into Frank's palm, a sudden wave of reality crashed over him. The dream was no longer just about hope and potential, it was about responsibility, management, and sustaining a fragile ecosystem that depended on more than just passion. Frank spent hours at the building each day, juggling repairs, budgets, and schedules. The excitement that had filled the space now mingled with tension as he realized the true cost of ownership wasn't just financial. It was emotional and physical. Volunteers came and went, some burned out, others clashed over priorities. Frank found himself mediating disputes, balancing expectations, and facing bureaucracy head-on. One morning, a leak appeared in the ceiling above the workshop, sending a cold drip onto a table piled with prototypes and notebooks. The repair would cost more than they had anticipated, threatening to drain the funds raised with so much effort. Frank sat on the floor, feeling the weight of it all pressed down like the gray clouds gathering outside. Doubts whispered louder than ever. Had they bitten off more than they could chew? The exhaustion seeped into his bones, but in the quiet moments, he remembered Elon Musk's words from a documentary: persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up. That stubbornness stirred something in Frank's heart. He refused to give up, not just for himself, but for everyone who counted on the makerspace to be a sanctuary, a launching pad, a home. At the next board meeting, Frank proposed a partnership with a local vocational school to share resources and expertise. It was a gamble, but it promised to ease the financial burden and broaden their impact. The vote was close, but ultimately approved, signaling a new chapter of collaboration and growth. Meanwhile, Frank also faced personal trials. His health, already fragile, began to falter again. Persistent fatigue led to a hospital visit where tests revealed early signs of a heart condition. The doctor's words were gentle but firm: "You need to slow down and prioritize your well-being, Frank. The makerspace needs you, but not at the expense of your health." The news hit him hard. How could he slow down when so many depended on him? Mallory stayed by his side, reminding him that true leadership was about knowing when to rest and when to fight. "You're not alone," she said softly. "We're in this together." As he recovered, Frank leaned more heavily on the community and volunteers. He learned to trust others with decisions, accepting that his role was evolving. The makerspace became less about one man's vision and more about a shared dream shaped by many voices. One afternoon, during a celebration marking the one-year anniversary of their ownership, Frank looked around at the faces illuminated by warm light and laughter. There were young and old, newcomers and longtime friends, all bound by the spirit of creativity and resilience. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, fears, and sacrifices. But the space pulsed with life, with stories yet to be told and projects yet to be built. Frank felt a profound sense of peace mixed with determination. He realized that owning the makerspace wasn't about control or perfection, it was about stewardship, about nurturing something bigger than himself. And in that realization, he found new strength to face whatever lay ahead. The horizon was uncertain, but Frank was ready. With a heart full of hope and a community beside him, the future felt wide open and full of promise. The makerspace had become a beacon of hope and creativity, but beneath the surface, tension simmered like a quiet storm. Frank had learned that building something meaningful wasn't just about passion, it was also about navigating the complexities of human nature. One crisp morning, as the sun filtered softly through the tall windows, Frank arrived to find an uneasy silence hanging in the air. The usual chatter and clinking of tools were absent, replaced by murmurs and worried faces. It didn't take long to discover why. A trusted volunteer, a man named Carl who had been instrumental in fundraising and community outreach, was accused of mishandling funds. The news hit Frank like a punch to the gut. Carl had been more than a volunteer. He was a friend, a pillar of their movement. The betrayal felt like a knife twisting deep. Frank's mind raced with disbelief and anger, but he knew he had to act carefully. The community's trust was fragile, and the stakes were too high to let this spiral out of control. The board called an emergency meeting. Tension filled the room as people exchanged anxious glances. Frank spoke first, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "We need transparency and fairness. We owe it to everyone who believes in this space." Investigations revealed that Carl had diverted a portion of the funds to cover personal debts. The betrayal was undeniable. Frank wrestled with conflicting emotions, disappointment, sorrow, but also a resolve to protect what they had built. News of the scandal spread quickly, and the makerspace faced backlash from donors and the wider community. Volunteers wondered if the dream they'd nurtured could survive the stain of dishonesty. Frank held town hall meetings, answering tough questions with honesty. He shared the lessons of resilience he'd learned from Elon Musk, who had faced setbacks and betrayals but never abandoned his vision. "This is a test," Frank said to a packed room. "We will not let this break us. We will rebuild stronger." Slowly, the makerspace began to heal. New policies were implemented to ensure transparency, and a renewed commitment to integrity took hold. Carl stepped away, and though the pain lingered, the community rallied around the idea that no one was perfect, but everyone deserved a chance to learn and grow. Through the storm, Frank found unexpected support in Mallory and Dylan, whose belief in the Makerspace mission never wavered. Together, they organized events that brought the community closer, reminding everyone why they fought so hard to keep this place alive. One evening, as Frank sat alone in the quiet workshop, he pulled out a worn notebook filled with Elon Musk quotes. One stood out: "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." Frank realized that betrayal and setbacks were part of the journey, painful but necessary lessons on the path to growth. The Makerspace was not just a building or a project, it was a living testament to resilience, to the courage to keep moving forward even when the light flickered. As the weeks passed, trust slowly rebuilt itself. New volunteers arrived, inspired by the story of survival. The Makerspace reopened its doors with renewed purpose, ready to face the future with open hearts and determined minds. Frank knew the road ahead would not be smooth, but he also knew that together, they had the strength to turn shadows into light. It was late in the evening, long after most of the lights had gone off in the Makerspace, when Frank found himself standing alone in the main hall. The concrete floor echoed faintly under his steps, and the scent of sawdust and solder lingered in the air like the memory of an old friend. He leaned against a workbench, hands in his jacket pockets, and looked up at the ceiling, where they'd patched the old leak months ago. Everything felt different now, heavier and yet more grounded. The betrayal from Carl had left a scar, but like all scars, it also reminded him how far they'd come, how much they had endured. The community had held. The dream had bent but never broken. And now something was stirring in him again. He felt it in the silence. In the way his mind didn't rush with worry, but instead, opened like a window to a breeze he didn't know he needed. That week, a group of college students from out of town visited the Makerspace as part of a social innovation tour. They weren't just impressed, they were moved. One of them, a tall young man with wide eyes and restless energy, had said, "This place feels alive. Like a story that's still being written." That line stuck with Frank. It reminded him of something Elon Musk had said in a TED Talk years ago, about how the future is written by those who dare to imagine something wildly different, and then commit to making it real, one mistake at a time. Frank started asking himself a new question: what if this wasn't the finish line? What if the Makerspace wasn't the final chapter, but the beginning of something bigger, something that could spread beyond the walls of this old building? What if there were more places like this? More towns with older folks waiting quietly for something to remind them that their time wasn't up, just paused. The thought was electric. What if they created a model, a blueprint, for community-powered innovation centers for people over 60? Places where retirees could learn, mentor, build, rediscover, and, most of all, matter. The next morning, he shared the idea with Mallory. She listened without interrupting, then nodded slowly. "It's bold," she said. "But you've been bold since the day you stepped out of that garage with a screwdriver and a reason." Frank smiled. He sketched out the idea on paper, filling page after page with thoughts. Modular community spaces, intergenerational labs, online courses, traveling toolkits, funding strategies, storytelling channels. The more he wrote, the more it made sense. It wasn't just about keeping the lights on in one building anymore. It was about lighting thousands more. That same week, a message came from a small town in Ohio. A woman named Celia had read about the Makerspace online and wanted advice on starting something similar in her town's abandoned train depot. "We've got old-timers with skills," she wrote, "and kids with no place to go. I think we could bring them together." Frank called her personally. They spoke for over an hour. By the end of the call, he promised to help. Not just with advice, but with structure, with materials, with experience. "We've made the mistakes," he said. "We can help you make fewer." From that single conversation, the seed of the Makerspace network was planted. Frank rallied the team. They formed a planning group, reached out to grant organizations, and launched a pilot program to support 3 new centers in small towns across the state. The momentum was exhilarating. For every doubter, there were 5 believers. Mallory helped create a digital platform to share blueprints, success stories, and how-to guides. Volunteers recorded videos, wrote tutorials, and traveled to visit new communities. The movement was real. Frank, in his early 70s, was suddenly leading something national. He didn't seek the spotlight, but it found him anyway. Interviews, articles, even an invitation to speak at a national aging and innovation conference. He stood on a stage in front of hundreds, wearing the same worn blazer he'd worn when he first opened the Makerspace doors. And when the spotlight hit him, he didn't stumble. He told the story, about invisibility, about being sidelined, about the lonely ache of feeling useless. He told them about the quiet rage that builds when no one asks what you still have to offer. And then he told them about the spark. About Musk's words that shook him. About walking again, building again, living again. We don't age out of value, he said. We just stop being invited in. This, what we're doing, it's an invitation. Back into life. The applause lasted long after he stepped off the stage. Back home, the Makerspace was buzzing. The original location had become a training hub, and Frank was no longer the sole leader. Others had stepped up, found their voice, and carried the torch beside him. One day, Dylan visited after school, bringing a classmate and a model drone they were building. Frank watched them work, his heart full. Dylan looked up and said, "You know, Grandpa, I want to do something like this someday. Help people feel important." Frank had to turn away for a moment, overcome with emotion. All of it, the fight, the heartbreak, the sleepless nights, it had all led to this legacy. Not in trophies or headlines, but in people. In impact. In love passed forward. That evening, sitting under the stars with Mallory, Frank whispered, "I used to think the best thing I ever built was that old solar water heater in '82. She chuckled. And now? He looked out at the lights still glowing in the Makerspace windows. Now I think, maybe it's this. Not a thing. A space. A reason. A future. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "It was never too late," she said softly. And Frank, eyes full of gratitude, whispered back, "It never is." Winter arrived early that year, and with it came a silence Frank hadn't expected. The Makerspace was still running, the new locations were finding their rhythm, and the network they'd started was slowly expanding. But deep inside, Frank felt something shifting. The energy that had carried him, fueled him, was changing shape. Not fading, exactly. But, settling. He began waking up a little later. His hands ached more than usual. And for the first time in months, he found himself lingering by the front window of his house, not to plan, not to think, just to watch the wind pass through the bare trees. He kept it to himself at first. Not because he was hiding anything, but because he wasn't sure how to name it. It wasn't fatigue, or illness, or even doubt. It was more like a question had begun to form in him again. The same kind of question that had started all of this. But this time, it wasn't, "Am I too old to matter?" He had already answered that. It was something softer, deeper. What now? One snowy morning, a letter arrived. A grant organization that had supported their Makerspace initiative for over a year was pulling out due to restructuring. Their funding had helped launch 2 new sites and supported dozens of traveling workshops. Without it, the entire outreach model was at risk. Frank sat with the letter in his hands, his coffee untouched, his eyes scanning the words over and over. This was a hit, maybe the biggest since Carl's betrayal. It didn't just threaten their momentum. It threatened the very idea that had made everything else feel possible. He called an emergency meeting. The core team, Mallory, and even Rachel joined by video call. "We're not dead in the water," Rachel said. "But we have to rethink the scale. Fast." Tension rippled through the room. Mallory tapped her fingers against her notebook, glancing toward her father. Frank was unusually quiet. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with frustration or panic. "This isn't the first time something we built has been threatened," he said. "And it won't be the last. But we've never been about the money. We've always been about the spark." He paused, searching for the right words. "Maybe this is the moment we turn inward again, not to shrink, but to remember why we started." The decision was made to pause the expansion. They would protect what already existed. Focus on depth instead of breadth. Mentor instead of manage. The shift was hard. Some in the network felt disappointed. Others relieved. But for Frank, it brought an odd peace. He had chased the dream out into the world. Now, maybe, it was time to come home to it. In the following weeks, Frank began stepping back from the day-to-day operations. He spent more time with Dylan, teaching him how to repair old tools and write simple code. He wrote letters to the leaders of the other spaces, encouraging them not just to keep going, but to make it their own. "What you build doesn't have to look like what we built," he wrote. "It just has to carry the same fire." One evening, sitting in the workshop while a gentle snow tapped against the windows, Frank pulled out the very first notebook he'd started when this all began. The pages were yellowed, curled at the corners. At the top of the first page, in his handwriting, was a question: "What if I'm not done?" He stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, he added a line beneath it. "What if I was just getting started?" As he sat back, he thought of Musk again, not as the billionaire on magazine covers, but the man in those early videos, surrounded by parts, staring down impossible odds with a stubborn belief that the future could still be built. Frank hadn't reached space, but in his own way, he had launched something just as far-reaching. A belief. A model. A movement. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to become the spark for someone else. The next morning, Frank announced something no one expected. He would be stepping down as director. The room fell silent. Mallory blinked, stunned. "Dad, are you sure?" He smiled gently. "It's not an ending. It's a beginning, for all of you. You've got the vision now. The fire. It's your turn to carry it forward." Rachel was the first to stand and clap. One by one, others followed. Not in mourning, but in respect. Frank didn't cry. He just stood there, watching the team he helped shape rise to meet the moment without him. It was the proudest he had ever felt. Over the following weeks, Frank moved into a quieter rhythm. He still came to the makerspace, but now as a mentor, a guide, a kind of elder in residence. He hosted storytelling nights, taught workshops on solar energy, even mentored veterans starting their own repair shops. The fire was still there. Just different now. Not consuming. Just glowing. One night, as he and Dylan worked on a small robot project for school, Dylan looked up and asked, "Did you ever think you'd do all this?" Frank chuckled. "Not in a million years." "Why'd you do it?" Dylan asked. Frank looked at his grandson. "Because someone reminded me I wasn't finished. That I could still create something that mattered. Sometimes, that's all it takes. One spark." Dylan nodded, the moment sinking into him like sunlight into soil. A seed planted. Outside, the snow fell quietly. The makerspace stood warm against the cold. A light in the dark. Not because of Frank alone, but because he'd dared to go first. The sun was rising over the town, casting long gold streaks across the quiet streets, and Frank sat on a bench just outside the makerspace, the building that once felt like a fragile hope now standing strong, permanent, and alive. He held a thermos of coffee, steam curling into the chilly morning air, and listened to the faint sounds of movement inside. Even before the doors officially opened, someone was always tinkering, rearranging, imagining. He loved that. That sense that possibility didn't punch a clock. It arrived early, stayed late, and never cared about age. A little girl and her father walked past, the girl pointing up at the building. "That's where Grandma builds stuff," she said proudly. The father smiled and nodded. "Yep. She fixed your nightlight last week, remember?" The girl giggled. Frank watched them disappear around the corner, a quiet grin on his face. If you'd asked him 10 years ago whether he'd be sitting here, part of something like this, he would have said you were nuts. 10 years ago, he was a man wrapped in routine and silence. Not quite broken, but stalled. Forgotten by the pace of the world, dulled by loss, and convinced that his days of building, dreaming, reaching, those were behind him. And then came the spark. It didn't arrive with fireworks or a parade. It came quietly, in the form of a video, a quote, a glimpse of a man, Elon Musk, talking about why he didn't quit. About betting everything on the future, even when the odds seemed absurd. "You can't be afraid of failure," Musk had said. "If something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." That line cracked something open in Frank. Not because he saw himself in a billionaire, but because he saw what he'd lost, fire. Not the reckless kind, but the kind that warms you from the inside. That asks you to try again. From that spark came steps. From steps came movement. And from movement came people, friends, allies, builders, dreamers, some gray-haired, some just starting out, all of them needing one another in ways they didn't always understand. Frank took a long sip of coffee and thought about the letter on his kitchen table, the one from the Regional Community Development Council. They wanted to honor him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Not for any one invention or singular act, but for building something that lasted beyond him. He hadn't answered yet. He didn't need a plaque. He didn't want applause. What he wanted, was this. The hum of life. The feeling of being useful. The knowledge that something he started would go on. Mallory stepped outside and joined him on the bench. She didn't say anything at first, just sipped from her own cup, mirroring him like old times. "The robotics class is full again," she said eventually. "I think we'll need to open a second session next month." "Good problem to have," Frank said. She glanced sideways at him. "Are you sure you're okay with stepping back this far?" He chuckled. "Mallory, I've been in here nearly every day since we opened. And somehow, none of you let it burn down without me. That's the goal, isn't it? Build something that doesn't fall apart when you're gone." She smiled, but there was a touch of sadness in her eyes. "You're not gone, Dad. You're just watching from the wings now." He nodded. "Exactly. And it's beautiful." That evening, the community gathered in the workshop for one final storytelling night of the season. People brought their projects, drones, sculptures, furniture, handmade tools, and shared not just what they made, but why they made it. Helen talked about rebuilding the music box her late husband had given her. Marcus shared a 3D printed prosthetic hand he made for a neighbor. A retired welder named Sam described how teaching kids to weld gave him a reason to get out of bed again. Frank sat in the back, letting the stories wash over him. He didn't speak that night. He didn't need to. His story had already been folded into the wood grain of the benches, the grooves of the tools, the echo of laughter in the rafters. Near the end of the night, Dylan got up to speak. He held a small circuit board in his hands, one he'd designed himself. "This is nothing fancy," he said. "But it's the first thing I ever made on my own. Grandpa helped me get started, but he made me finish it myself. And when it didn't work the first time, he didn't fix it for me. He just looked at me and said, 'Try again.' That's the whole game." He held up the board. "It works now." The crowd clapped, but Frank just sat there, stunned by the moment. His grandson. Building. Speaking. Leading. It wasn't about the board. It was about what it represented, continuity. That something he'd reignited in himself had passed through him into someone else. As the event wrapped up and people began drifting out into the night, Frank stayed behind, running his hands over the old workbench where he'd sanded down his first birdhouse project after his hip surgery. He could still feel the weight of the wood. The uncertainty. The beginning. Mallory returned and stood beside him. "They want to name the new program after you," she said. "The traveling lab that goes to rural communities." "Call it something better," Frank said softly. "Call it the Spark Truck." "It was never about me." She nodded. "You lit it, though." "Only because someone lit it in me." Later that week, Frank finally wrote back to the awards committee. His letter was short and plain-spoken. He thanked them for the recognition but declined the honor. He wrote, "The work is the reward. And it isn't finished. There are still people out there who don't know they matter yet. Let's find them." On his 75th birthday, Frank walked alone to the hill above the town. He looked out over the rooftops, the trees, the little dot of the makerspace in the distance. The wind brushed against his coat, sharp and clean. He took a deep breath and whispered to no one in particular, "I thought I was done. Turns out, I was just waiting for someone to remind me that I still mattered." He smiled and closed his eyes for a moment, feeling it fully, gratitude, strength, and something that felt a lot like joy. Then he turned back toward the town, hands in his pockets, and started walking. One step. Then another. Not racing. Not running. Just moving forward. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?